very nice to meet you. I'm Lydia, and I think I know a lot of you in this room. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Lydia Doleman, and I have been building and working as a contractor with natural materials for the last 25 years here in Oregon. And this evening's presentation, we're going to focus on just an overview of natural building. We're going to start with sort of a macroscopic view. We're not going to focus, we'll focus 5% on problems and 95% on solutions. And there will be some kind of depressing slides in there, so just emotionally prepare yourself for that. And before we begin, I'd love to take a little inventory of everybody in the room. So how many people here are familiar with natural building? Okay, that's good. So I'm going to be sort of preaching to the choir, particularly those people over there. And then how many people here are builders? Conventional, awesome, awesome. Anybody here firefighter? Former, awesome. Structure firefighter? Fire sign, that counts. Awesome. And then how many people here are looking to build their own home in the next couple years? Super. All right, good. So when we think about fire, for most of us, when I think about fire season, I get this huge emotional upwhelming of anxiety. And there's something that I called anxious August, that for those of us in the Pacific Northwest start to feel this like, oh God, when is it gonna happen? And with that, since we're going to be talking about fire so much, I also want to talk about it in the sense that humans have had a direct relationship with fire for over 500,000 years. This is part of our co-evolution, and in fact, it makes us who we are. So even though that we're called Homo sapiens, which is supposed to mean that we're wise ones, if I were to rename us, since sometimes I question if we qualify for the wise one's name, is that really I would call us Homo ignis uteri, fire user, because with fire, we've externalized digestion, we've kept our places warm, we've kept away predators, and we've done internal combustion, which is the result of everything that is around us right now. And we live in a fire ecology. So this is very important for those of us who are living in the West to recognize that this is a key component to the habitat that we are existing in. So the fire ecology here in Ashland Watershed used to have what's called a fire regime of fire in the landscape every 8 to 11 years. So that's a pretty quick rotation of having fire present here. In addition to that, since the 1850s, we've been actively doing fire suppression. So what we have is an immense fuel buildup all along the West that is one of the contributing factors to why our fires are increasing in frequency and severity. And the other thing I like people to think about is, as residents of the Pacific Northwest, we live not only in a watershed to take into consideration where our water comes from, but we also live in a fire shed, which means that fire exists in this habitat, and we need to recognize it and also learn how to work with it. Because most of us out here know the phrase, it's not if, it's when. So that's something that we have to recognize, and particularly when we're talking about building. So if we don't end up having a good working relationship with this aspect that is all around us all the time, we end up with disasters like this, and things like this are avoidable if we make the right choices. So most people are going to understand this question, but for people who don't understand that, there is a significant difference between what is green building and what's natural building, and that's a very frequent question that I get, and there are some significant differences. The big difference is that green building is sort of an umbrella term where we're talking about just taking the environment, energy, and efficiency into account. And natural building takes that about 100 steps further. So natural building is a whole systems design. How many people here are familiar with the term permaculture? Okay, so most people. So essentially, it's a whole systems design being applied to how we look at shelter and buildings. And my favorite working definition from Starhawk for what permaculture is that it is the practical application that the earth is sacred. And so that's definitely a way to take into our work and to the meaning that we bring to our lives, is that we're practicing something that's sacred. But for most people, when I'm talking with mostly conventional construction people, that is just something that's kind of far removed from their way of looking at the world. So primarily, when we're talking about natural building materials, is that we're talking about materials that are non-toxic. And this is key because we're looking at materials from that whole systems design that are non-toxic in production and in end use. So in that, we're also considering where our materials come from, who's handling them, what the effects are for them, and then the end product use. So I had one person at a certain point say, hey, can you make me a house so healthy I can eat it? And I felt like that was a really great request in terms of how we look at our building materials. In addition to being non-toxic, clay is kind of the universal binder adhesive that we use in our natural building materials. And clay is known for its non-toxic characteristics. So one is that it has an ionic charge that is generally negatively charged, which attracts positively charged particles, which can also be bacteria and viruses. So you'll see some people who are ingesting clay that you can pay a lot of money to have it put on your face. And you would not go into a big box building store and take any of the products there and ingest them and put them on your face and be better for it. And there's a ton of stuff that I could go into about talking about clay for hours and hours, but we're just gonna leave it right there. But here's where we get into kind of the sad, dark, scary stuff. And like Angie was mentioning, the list of chemicals that are in our building materials is nightmarishly long. And sometimes ignorance is bliss, and it's just better sometimes just to not go into too many details about that. And then when we think about that in the context of a fire, of building your house, is that ultimately it's not the flames that kill the people, it's the smoke. And not only is smoke just on its own toxic for you, but when you talk about all of the chemicals that's in the carpet and the fire retardant in the paint and all of the composite materials that are in there, this is very dangerous and hazardous to our health. That is also in terms of, we're looking at the pinpoint sources of where there's the people who are producing these materials, their exposure to it, and then the people who are implementing, the builders who are installing that, and then the people living in these houses. So much so to the point that there's something called sick building syndrome, where people can be just sick from being inside of a building that is off-gassing with all of these materials. And again, if you want to learn more about it, Paula, who is a local, Paula Baker Laporte, who's an amazing architect and designer, also wrote a book about all of this if you want to learn how to kind of remove that from your buildings. But you don't necessarily have to think about that so much when you're choosing natural building materials. So another component of natural building materials is that they are minimally processed. And when we look at, this is kind of the holy trinity of the materials that go into natural building, where you have a fiber like straw here, and then you have a binder, which is the clay, and then you have some kind of aggregate, which is the sand or gravel in all of these. So you can kind of combine these three in a whole myriad of choices that you can look at that exists on 6 of the 7 continents, because humanity has been building with these materials since we started building. And you can see a beautiful convergent evolution. We're looking at indigenous building practices in the Southwest to places in Africa to areas in the middle of nowhere in Russia where people have been choosing the same materials without ever having to converse about how to do that. So I think that's very emblematic of it being deep in our DNA to be working with these materials. The other aspect of that, them being minimally processed, is that it's kind of the opposite of the heat, beat, and treat methods, and this is the terminology in industrialized products applied to conventionally manufactured materials. And in addition to that, we're also talking about minimizing the embodied energy that goes into the materials, which has a much bigger effect on a global scale. Another component is that when we look at locally sourced materials, like Jerry was talking about, how important it is to pull from place. So from an energy consumption standpoint, the longer something travels to you, the more embodied energy that is in there. But the other aspect is you begin building place-based buildings, which is another word for vernacular. So for folks who have traveled to other countries and been wowed by the beautiful architecture that calls to you, that speaks to you, that tells you the story of the people in the place building those houses, that is something that resonates with you. And here in America, it's like that building style gets superimposed on us by building industries and their projection of this is what you're going to build with and this is how you're going to build. And with that, everything comes from somewhere. So in that whole systems look at how we're looking at our building projects is that we are responsible for taking from the earth from where our materials come from. Does anybody know what this is at the top of the screen? Anybody recognize this? Taos Pueblo. And so this is an Adobe structure that is in the Southwest, and it is the longest continuously inhabited structure in North America. People living in there for over 1,000 years. Now this is like perfectly emblematic of what sustainability is. So these are all local natural resources that have been able to go into this structure to create beautiful, functional shelter for over 1,000 years. So how many people live in a house that's over 150 years old here? Not many people. And so with that, there's also a longevity in design in these materials because they exist in the place. And this is New York City skyline. And that is definitely not place-based building. And in fact, it's on a swamp that's drained. And to think about where all of these materials come is to think about almost like the Swiss cheese of the surface of the earth from where all of that extraction came from. So with industrialized materials, when we were looking at them from this like remote to the shoes I was wearing, is really you're generally only looking at 11% of the material that's left. So where is the rest of that going? So when we talk about minimally processed, it really has all of this synergistic positive effects. Another aspect is it's low tech. And when we talk about low tech, we also talk about inclusivity. So you don't have to have a 4-year architecture degree or engineering degree, or you do not need to have gone through a multi-year apprenticeship program. You can come and participate because these materials don't necessarily need specialized tools. Now with natural building, all of that can be scaled up in an industrialized way, but at its very core, it's basic, it's quiet, it's simple, and it's inclusive. And with all of that, we can have a much broader demographic of people participating in the built environment than we do currently in Western culture. And with that, you get human-scaled places when they are basically built by people with materials in a place. So if we look at the kind of juxtaposition of these two pictures, what they really do is they tell you a story about your social architecture. And the key component here is that we're looking at something that's very human scaled. You can see the human shape in there. It's not been in this orthogonal, rectilinear, manufactured experience. So it's kind of inviting, and you might feel invited, you might feel curious, you might feel welcomed when you're in a space like this. Whereas when we look at these structures on the other side, what we're also looking at is something very symbolic of a pyramidal social structure that it takes to take all the embodied energy to make steel, glass, concrete, and aluminum in order to build these very pyramidal, these very vertical skyscrapers. And another thing is you can always build a gigantic natural building if you want to build gigantic, but most people keep it relatively small for simplicity and energy efficiency. And there's a stress about quality over quantity. And with that, I consider all of those things working together, and just the very nature of natural building, and I think Angie can attest to this, or anybody who's been in a natural building, most people, as soon as they walk into that building, they want to put their hand on the wall. They want to touch it. They want to interact with it. And there's kind of like this deep inner magnetism of connecting with those materials. And given that one of the biggest epidemics in the United States right now is loneliness and a sense of disconnection, this is a tool of connectivity where you can connect people to place, to each other, to materials. And when you're talking about having a community building with these materials, collectively building and having a sense of reflection of their efforts in the world around them, is you build up a sense of empowerment so that people are participating in the built world around them. In fact, you're building them a sense of home. And one thing that I love about natural building is that it begins to dismantle this myth that we are taught as growing up, is that we are different and separate from nature. It's about coming home. So the other aspect to it is that you always have a breathable wall system. And breathable is really great in a lot of ways, particularly when talking about vapor permeability, but particularly when you have a clay plaster on the interior of your structures, of which all natural buildings usually have a clay or a lime plaster to maintain that breathability, is that clay does a fantastic job of regulating the humidity in a space that makes it much easier on your sinuses and your lungs when you're breathing. And it's fun to do. So this is also part of the appeal for people, is to be able to participate and put in the sweat equity, if you want to put it that, if you want to use that terminology, for building your own home and place. And I've worked with a variety of groups, from children to houseless people to Fortune 500 people. Now here's the thing for the numbers people that really brings it home, how natural building is definitely a tool for fire resiliency. And the biggest one is carbon sequestration. So straw, which is the primary wall system that I'm going to have a heavy focus on here, but hempcrete also falls into this category. It sequesters a ton of carbon in its production. So straw, 60 times the carbon it requires to grow it, making it the lowest carbon footprint possible for any kind of insulation material. And with that, as we're going to talk about carbon for just a brief moment here, is the building sector consumes nearly half of all the energy produced in the United States. And then when we look at the lifetime costs of a building, 75% of that is energy use in terms of heating and cooling. So whether you do anything natural at all, as long as you build an energy efficient building and help reduce those costs, is you are creating less of a drain on the system. And so for those of us in Southern Oregon, we've watched all of our power bills go up and up and up, even though we're looking at solar panels here and energy efficient appliances, because basically as our economy continues to grow, is we are growing our energy consumption. And this is a way to reduce our overall energy consumption and also sequestering carbon. So the cool thing about these wall systems, whether it's straw bale, hempcrete, cork, I'm not going to go into cork because it doesn't grow locally here, dense packed cellulose, wool, or any of these fiber-based wall systems, is that they are carbon negative. So they're actually sucking carbon out of the atmosphere and you're storing it into a residence that ideally lasts for a very long time. So what we call this is drawdown technology. So imagine as we have to rebuild our building stock, whether it's after a catastrophic fire event or just this time, it's time to rebuild or it's time to build new, a house could actually be this net positive effect on our atmospheric issue that we're dealing with the carbon loading in our, in terms of climate change. Which is just pretty awesome to be like, there is something that you actually can do that has a positive influence. Now again, when we talk about that division between green building and natural building, all of these materials up here would be considered green building because they are energy efficient. So foam is super duper insulative, but has a huge carbon footprint. So anytime you can avoid using any of these materials and choose these, you're doing our atmosphere a service. Okay, so this is why we were really all here this evening, is to talk about fire resiliency. So the materials I'm talking about are natural wall systems, and they are incredibly fire resilient. So we're gonna look at different wall systems, and then we're gonna look at some case studies. And this is me trying to burn a building down that won't burn. So first question, statistical probability of a house fire. Anybody know this one? This is a cheery topic. 1 in 1,200, according to the National Fire Protection, which is kind of disturbing. And I tried to look up the statistics for wildfire, and I think it's just one of those mathematical equations that you can't really come up with, but I'm sure insurance companies are looking at that. Most of these are caused by cooking. So natural building systems for fire resiliency. So if we're looking at living in an area in the Pacific Northwest where fire is gonna be on the landscape, we have some options for what we wanna do. The first ones we're gonna look at are the fiber-based wall systems, and that is straw bale, light straw clay, hempcrete, dense packed cellulose, wool, and wood fiberboard. All of these are recognized in the International Building Code or the Residential Building Code here. All of these meet energy code if done correctly. So the reason I'm stressing these instead of the mineral-based or earth-based wall systems is that where we are in the Pacific Northwest, they do not meet the energy code, where we have to make sure that our buildings are well insulated. So we'll start with straw bale. And straw bale has a history back in Nebraska in the 1920s, and back when we invented the baling machine, because this is the plains where there's grain growing everywhere, they were baling up the waste straw that was there. And there was a family that took their late season hay, baled it up, and were like, instead of building a sod house, which is what some people were building out of, where you're just shoveling up dirt and making a wall, which the sod houses did very well in the summer because they kept cool, but were kind of miserable in the cold Nebraska winters. So they stacked up their hay bales, and then they put a roof directly on top. So there's no wood in this, because in Nebraska, there weren't like Home Depots and lumber yards all over the place in the 1920s. You kind of had to do with what you had in that place. And they were incredibly comfortable in the winter. So this is a house that's been around since 1925, and it's very symbolic of what eventually became a revival of straw bale building in the 90s. And that coincided with the Sacramento Valley banning the burning of straw. So we had a moment in time where it's like all of a sudden farmers have to have this product that they used to just burn to make go away, and now they're baling up and there's no place for it. So in building with bales, it was a win for builders because they could offer this awesome insulation, homeowners, because they could not only participate in the building of their home, but then they also had a really energy efficient home, which makes it good for the environment, and then also really good for farmers. Straw bale, you've got two styles. You have the Nebraska style where the roof sits right on top of the walls, or you have post and beam. And there's a few other wall systems that I won't go too much into just because we got a lot to cover. And you stack them up like big fuzzy bales. Now, at a certain point, someone's gonna kind of be like, so doesn't straw just like burn really easy? And it does. So here, you can't really see here, but there is a no smoking sign. And this is a post and beam house. And we've got straw going on the inside. And we're about to wrap the whole interior in bales. Now, every job site, conventional or natural, goes through what I call the gangly adolescent vulnerable stage, where it is flammable because you have woody little beaver dams everywhere that could basically catch on fire. And that is when you might have an electrical issue, you might actually have some kind of wildfire, you might have someone who's smoking on site, or you might have someone grinding metal that creates a spark that causes that. So with any straw project, I'm always very religious that we scrape all of the loose straw out during the construction process at the end of every single day. And no smoking allowed. Otherwise, you're looking at something like this, and that would be true of any building project. And I love that this is called Tonight's the Night for some weird reason. And then on the inside, the wall gets wrapped with straw, encased in here, and then it gets covered with a plaster. So for most buildings, we're doing a lime plaster on the exterior, and we're doing an earth plaster on the interior for that good air quality. And also the earth has less embodied energy in it than the lime, but the lime is very protective because it doesn't dissolve in the rain like clay does. And this is a pretty good example of a pretty fire resilient, for the most part, building where it's got the metal roof, it's got hardened soffits, it's got the lime exterior plaster, it has a lot of defensible space around it. The weak zones would be the cedar trellising here, which is like a little nest of kindling underneath your deck, which would probably not be something I would recommend if you were really, really worried about fire encroaching on your house. This is another style of straw bale, and this one is actually wrapped in conventional siding because it had to match another building. But again, you can see this is like the work site is always the messiest time when there's just a ton of flammable debris around the building. And this is another project. This is actually in Jackson County. And this one looks like a really good demonstration of how to fireproof your house, where you've got the metal roof. Again, this under part here called the soffit is hardened, which means that there's no wood under here. There's non-flammable material, lots of defensible space, and no real wood on the exterior except for some of these bigger timbers. And then they've got these cement sills here. This is another straw bale. So this is Ken and Polly Cooper's. They're north of San Luis Obispo, and they had an original straw bale house that burned down in a fire. So when they rebuilt, they chose straw bale again, but this time they were like, we're prepared. And so they did much harder surfaces, and then they also installed a sprinkler system on their roof. And we'll go into a little bit more about sprinkler systems. And yeah, and they have a very architect-y passive solar design, and for anybody building anything, no matter what you're building out of it, it would make the most sense to implement passive solar design, because passive solar just means that you're keeping the sun out in the summer, so you're not spending all that money trying to cool your house down, and in the winter, you're allowing the sun to come in to passively heat your house. Okay, so here are some case studies, and this is courtesy of an architecture firm in California that's been designing and building with straw bale for over 25 years. That's ARC11. And what we have is a handful of buildings here that have experienced fire. So you can kind of see that they do, these are testaments and testimonials to the fact that they do survive. So this project in Sonoma, again, you can see metal roof. And even though asphalt shingles say that they are fire rated, they burn pretty easy. So that would be the first design choice I would make, would be to not have an asphalt shingle roof. And then they have their plastered walls on the exterior. They don't have a ton of vegetation growing around here. And then you can see when the fire did come up, it burnt pretty close to the building. And they do have, oh no, it's a different one. But here, the way they design this with the windows being recessed, if the window is in the same plane when the flames are coming up here, you can get a temperature differential from the inside temperature of the building and the outside. And for any of you who've made glasses from wine bottles where you score the glass and then you dip one side in hot water and the other side in cold and then it cracks, that's essentially the same thing. And then that's how fire gets into your building. So having these recessed windows is a little bit of an insurance policy. The other aspect is that they have double pane windows. And if you're in an incredibly fire-prone area and you're pretty sure that at some point you're going to experience fire, you can spend the money and get triple pane windows. Because once the fire breaches your window, there's nothing you can really do about it. This is the same building, different areas. So when the fire burnt up, it actually got hot enough to alter the color in the lime plasters. And here where they have a sliding wooden barn door, it just charred the barn. And here they have just metal over, there's no soffits here, it's just their rafters coming out. And the rafters were big enough and they got lucky enough that it didn't, the fire did not breach into the roof. And so that's what we're gonna see is how some of these buildings end up struggling. So this is another straw bale project. The fire came around, given that the vegetation is still pretty green, it doesn't seem like it was a super severe fire, but you can see here where it burned pretty close to the building. And again, recessed windows and big timbers and metal roof. So they're kind of checking all of their boxes for being fire resilient in that way. And this is another straw bale project where the fire encroached. They also have all of this hardscaping around their building, so it's next to impossible for the flames to come up right next to the building. And in this area, they also had quite a bit of defensible space, which means no big trees, no shrubs around the building. And they were just getting charring on their wood. And again, a lot of these cases, just because it's such a complicated system, when fire moves through, there's not as much predictability as you get when you're in testing facilities, testing for how things burn. Sometimes your number's just up. And so the goal is to build resiliency and redundancy in your systems so that you're not just dependent on one thing to protect you from the fire. And this is a story in Napa. This building did not make it. And part of it could have been conditions. Another part of it could have been these design issues where you have wooden soffits exposed over here. You have wooden trellises attached to the building. I'm assuming this is not wooden siding, but it could have been wooden siding. And then you also have the glass that's in the same plane as the exterior. And then what happened for here is that the straw bales walls didn't burn until the roof was breached, and the fire came in from the top and then crept all the way down. So I've had two experiences with straw bale burning inside of the wall. And one, when I lived in Colorado, I had a friend who had a straw bale sauna, and we would have full moon saunas. So we went one full moon. It smells kind of weird in here. Did our little sauna. Next full moon comes along. Still smells kind of weird in here. So the third full moon sauna came, my friend who was coming in to light the fire put his hand on the wall and was like, wait a minute, the wall's warm, I haven't even lit the fire yet. And open up the wall, and what had been happening is that through radiant heat from the wood stove being too hot, it had caused combustion within the straw bale wall that had just been like creeping and crawling because there's no oxygen because these bales are so dense. Loose straw burns super well. Condensed straw in a straw bale form does not burn, it just smolders. And the same thing happened with the house in Williams where the wood stove was set too close to the wall. And eventually over time, once something reaches its little point of combustion, it starts to catch on fire and it just smoldered through the wall for who knows how long. And then the challenge with that is once it reaches an open cavity where that flame can reach oxygen and find some other fuel, that's where you end up with things becoming difficult. So as it stands, the straw bale walls are not the issue. It's the wood members that are exposed under the wrong conditions that end up causing house fire. And this is a project in Europe from Eco Cocoon, and they do, from a more industrial perspective, panelized straw bale wall systems, which we could do like a whole other talk on. But it's a kind of more industrial, but a quicker way to tilt up all of your walls. And what happened is they had a bit of an attic fire, and only the very outer surface of their straw bale burned. It was the wood in the attic that ended up being the issue here. And you can see the fire department hosing it all down. And if you can kind of see here, like none of these bales burned when they were excavating to do the repair work. So that's straw bale. Straw bale has the most case studies, probably is the most prevalent of all the natural building systems. So there's a lot of research on it, and it seems to be incredibly resilient when it comes to fire, if, of course, you do all the details correctly. Light straw clay is kind of cousin of straw bale, and there's a few reasons why it's appealing, and part of it is you can kind of pick the thickness of your wall. So if you're in an urban area and you don't necessarily have the design capacity for a 24-inch or a 16-inch wall system, you might choose something like light straw clay. And what light straw clay is you take a straw bale, you unfurl it, and you toss it with a clay slip, and then you pack it into forms into a framed structure, and it's compatible with just about any kind of framing structure, and then it dries out. And then once it's dried out, you cannot burn it. It is basically every little piece of straw is coated in fireproof clay, and so it will only do barely a smolder. But I don't have any case studies of these surviving fire or being destroyed by fire. So this is just an example of a project in Portland that maybe doesn't have the best fire detailing, where you've got cedar wainscoting here, and you've got exposed wooden soffits, and you have single pane windows. So this would most likely not survive, but you would have light straw clay left over. And the other aspect, since a lot of us witnessed the cleanup after the Alameda fire or heard about the horrors of cleaning up after the Lahaina fire, is that cleaning up a project like this, you have less toxins to contend with in the end. You basically have compost. EcoNest, this is a company here in Southern Oregon with Paula and Robert Baker Laporte, and she's an architect and he's a builder. And they do these beautiful, exquisitely framed timber frames with light straw clay. Very beautiful. The only thing is that this building has the wooden soffits here that make it vulnerable, so that, you know, when you're standing by a fire, you can enjoy the heat here, but if you're standing over a fire, you're dinner. So that is where you get kind of into the dinner zone. Hempcrete. So everybody is super excited about hempcrete. And so hempcrete is basically where you're taking from the fiber growing hemp, not the CBD hemp that we see everywhere here, where it's the long, tall, fibrous stalks. And once the fiber is removed, they're taking what's called the hurd. So it almost looks like little tiny wood chips of hemp that then get mixed with a lime cement or a lime and a pozzolan, which makes it like cement mix. And that gets mixed just like light straw clay and then packed into forms, and then it goes through a curing process. It's kind of like a giant Rice Krispie treat, sort of what it looks like. But once again, you could pick the thickness of your wall as to how thick you want to do it. And in order to meet energy code, both with hempcrete and light straw clay, you need to do at least a foot. But that gives you some modularity in terms of how much insulation you want, and based on your design and what your square foot footprint is. And again, these systems all get covered with a plaster. So we'll look at another slide in a second. And the plaster does fourfold. One is that it's beautiful. It's an opportunity for sculpture and making your space feel really lovely and beautiful. And then it also protects the wall just from wear and tear, but it also protects it from fire. That's the key, the first barrier to fire, and then also protects from rodents and insects. So here's a hempcrete fire test that it underwent, and this has no plaster on it. So this is just blasting at the wall without the fire protection. And it was singed but not burned after 60 minutes under 1700 degrees of fire exposure, which is just really hot. You're melting aluminum at that point, and then soaked with water. So they put the flames out. And this is a hempcrete brick that has quite a bit of binder in it, since you can't see that sort of Rice Krispie texture, and it's basically fireproof. So these are great. And again, when we think back to that image of where this is on the carbon drawdown technology, so we can both be fireproof and being net positive towards ideally trying to mitigate the climate change that's exacerbating our drier, hotter, windier summers. Hempcrete, it's Angie's project. So hempcrete can be exquisite and absolutely beautiful, highly sculptural, very dynamic, fun material to work with. Other systems, wool. So this is a natural wall system, and the nice thing about this is it pairs well with conventional construction. So for people who are like, I don't really want to jump whole hog into the natural building realm, but I'm just going to do something conventional because either I'm working with a contractor who's not comfortable, or for whatever reasons, wool is a really great alternative. And it also has some fireproofing aspects to it because it's high in nitrogen, it requires more oxygen, and it has this interesting cell structure that kind of swells when it gets exposed to heat. I could talk a lot about wool because it's pretty fun. But, and then dense packed cellulose. This is kind of old school. A lot of people just have dense packed cellulose because this is basically shredded up old newspapers. And this is actually becoming more expensive because we don't have printed media as much as we once did in our recycling streams. But same thing, incredibly dense, hard to get a flame in there. Natural material, does a great job insulating. A lot of people have this blown into their attic spaces, and then it's also great for retrofitting existing structures. So if you're looking at, I live in a 1905 house in Portland that doesn't have any insulation in it, I would like to not spend $400 a month on heating bills, you can blow this in there. And then wood fiber insulation, and this is something that's kind of being more developed. It's big in Europe, but United States is just a little bit behind as usual. And wood fiber is the same thing. It's kind of like a straw bale, but instead of the fiber coming from a field, it's coming from the forest. Now, in my perfect world, in my dream world, there would be a company or a group that could develop the technology that would selectively and sustainably harvest understory trees and beetle-kill trees in order to meet these needs. Who knows what the future holds in that? Okay, and then all of these systems get covered with a plaster. And that's either earth skin or a lime plaster skin, and it's either over some type of lath here. Let me get the right button. Okay, so clay or mineral-based wall systems, I'm gonna go over this pretty quickly, just because they don't meet energy code here on their own. So when we talked about the first ones, these are just highly insulative wall systems that will perform well in terms of being able to keep a nice controlled environment in there. But with the clay-based wall systems, we're looking at a mass system. So you know when you go outside on a sunny day and you put your foot on the asphalt or the concrete and it's hot on a sunny day and it's really cold on a winter day, it's this mass likes to absorb energy. So if you have a mass wall, it does a really great job of absorbing that energy and then slowly radiating it out over time. And that it doesn't do a good job of insulating. So if you were to try to heat a Cobb building that's about this big, it would take a ton of energy to heat up that space because it just wants to absorb all of that energy. So Cobb is the first one that we'll talk about because we see it in lots of places. It's super sculptural, lots of Cobb benches around. Clearly it's fireproof since we make ovens out of it. And really, it's just a composite of just clay and sand and rock. So another term that I've used it to interject it into building plans where I'm doing like a little Jedi mind trick is earth and masonry, because that doesn't set off any light bulbs. And it gets intermixed with straw, which gives it tensile strength. So the nice thing about Cobb is you're kind of almost weaving a rock that makes your house. So Oregon is known for Cobb. We've got the Cobb Cottage Company. We've got a lot of Cobb builders here. And it's load-bearing, it's fireproof, it's durable. There's 500-year-old Cobb houses in England. There's 900-year, 13-story Cobb towers in Yemen. This building material has been around, and it can be very earthquake resilient. However, it is not energy code compliant. So it's hard to get something like this permitted unless you add additional insulation. Adobe, this is totally applicable to the Southwest. That's what we think of when we think of down there. And it's basically the same thing as Cobb, but it's in brick form, and it dries and then gets stacked with a mortar between. And of course, made out of this material is super fireproof, but not appropriate for the Pacific Northwest unless you add insulation. Rammed earth construction, again, same thing. It's basically sand, aggregate, and clay, and in order to build it permitted, you have to add a certain amount of Portland cement. But this rammed earth building I thought was really beautiful because they didn't do a plaster skin just so that you can see all the layers of the earth that get tamped in there. And it's also a great demonstration of fire resilient design in that it's got the hardened soffits, the recessed windows, and not that much greenery around it to catch on fire. And then this is an interesting design in the Sonoran Desert where the roof kind of makes me scared because I would never want that much water coming down in the middle of my building. So they were brave. But it's beautiful. Earth bag construction. A lot of people are excited about this because you don't have to do the drying that you have to do with an Adobe brick. So it's basically sand and clay packed into a bag, and you can get all of these amazing organic shapes with it. Downside is that these will deteriorate pretty quickly in the sun unless covered with something. And then with domes, I would definitely make sure that whoever's doing the dome is a good background in engineering. There actually have been some really sad stories about it, but people are very excited about it because of super Adobe. And Super Adobe is basically the same thing, but it's a continuous bag, like a big spiral pot that goes up there. And the big thing is one of these survived the LA fires. So this was an article in the LA Times really talking about earth and buildings. So as this kind of gains mainstream popularity, then people can start exploring these ideas. Now this wouldn't be appropriate for where we are because it's just going to be cold in there, unless it's smaller. So in my perfect world, there would be a scalable building residential code for smaller buildings to not have to meet the same energy requirements as like a 2,800 square foot house. Because I've seen small 200 square foot or smaller Cobb structures that people are living in perform just fine in the winter because it's not that much to heat up, but something that's residential scale would be very difficult. I keep putting it at the wrong thing. And then Fastwall, I just threw this in there because this is a local company and they're using recycled wood chips that get demineralized and then coated in concrete to make these bricks. And the other reason I put it in there is, first of all, I love that they have 200-year durability. There's not many products that you can find that have that written on their label. Also non-toxic. And the other component of it is that these make really good foundation systems. So if we were to really go into the whole envelope of what goes into a house, foundation is key, and this is a much more environmentally friendly way to do your foundation, and it's made in Oregon. Okay, how's everybody doing? It's a lot of info. Okay, so lessons learned. So one place that we get a lot of information from is Australia. We have an Australian here in the room. So they have quite a relationship with what they call bushfires instead of wildfires. And they have ratings for all of their houses for where you build. And it's called the bushfire activity level. And you're either in the low zone, or then you get these numerical descriptions, or you're in the flame zone. And each one of these would have different regulations for how you build. And so here we are in the Pacific Northwest, and most of us are living in an area called the WUI. And I'm not talking about Ashland. I'm talking about the wildland-urban interface. And that is basically where you're not really in a city where everything is kind of hardened around you and the rest of it is just landscaping, is really you're next to the forest. And there is a thing, and this is kind of the scary thing, where, again, like the story of the wood stove too close to the straw bale wall, is that your house can just burn down, not because an ember touched it, but because the radiant heat was so hot and ferocious that your house, it just finds the little flamiest, weakest bit, and it burns down. So I would love to know what the crazy building codes are for here, and there's probably some pictures of houses that have survived that. But Australia is definitely far more advanced in terms of regulating how people construct around fires. So if you compare Australia to the United States, they've got a lot more requirements than we have a few in California, and the rest of it is just kind of local. And as someone who really wishes that when we come up with regulations in any sort that it could be nuanced and place-based, that would be great. But ideally, most of us could be educated enough, and our builders and our contractors and our designers would understand how to implement these things so that our buildings, regardless of what we're building out of, are a little more resilient. So some details, like, look at these people. Their house survived, which is kind of a miracle because they've got these wooden decks here, but sometimes you just get lucky. Okay, so this is a section, it's hard to read all of this, but basically the synopsis of what this says for building a house that is fire resilient is you've detailed your intersections where two different materials meet so that you can't get embers in there, and that you have hardened exterior, hardened soffit, you've got good gutter protection, you've got a metal roof, you've got your ridge beam here is detailed correctly so that embers can't get sucked up in there or sucked up in here, because if you get a fire in here, your whole house is pretty much toast. And that's kind of the synopsis of all of that right there. And then here's an example of a house that was designed specifically for wildfire coming through, where they've got these metal gutters that come down and protect their window openings. The whole surface is hardened. There might be some question about, like, okay, aesthetically, this isn't exactly what I want my house to look like, but it's built like a tank and it survived. So for anybody building a house, like, this is usually your single biggest financial and energetic and emotional investment in your life financially, other than maybe having kids. So you want them to survive, and you can kind of see where, like, the gutters melted off here. And then sprinkler systems. So I couldn't find any good a visual documentation of people who have survived, their houses have survived some of the fires. They're like, I just put a sprinkler out and my house survived. So sometimes just luck of having enough moisture around that space to diminish the embers coming in there will work great. However, there's 2 Achilles heels here. So here, particularly in Southern Oregon, when we get close to the fire season time, we don't have that much water. So there's not that much water available to pump out of creeks or irrigation ditches. And the other thing is that usually when we have a fire, the electricity goes out. So unless you're prepared to be self-sufficient with a generator and your own water source, then I would put a lot of energy into something like this. But it does seem to make a big impact. And then the other thing is being surrounded by green space. So this was actually from an article that was claiming that it was the metal roof that saved this house. But you can also tell that this house has a metal roof, and it totally burned. So what I notice about this is that there's a green space right here. So maybe they were just out of the line of embers, or maybe they didn't get the same radiant heat that exposed all of the houses to burn. And then you're the one person who has their house in the context of everybody else who lost their house. And that's Lahaina. So details to avoid. You're going to notice a theme here: wooden fences in your buildings, attached wooden decks, wooden siding, wood. Even though I love wood, I am a carpenter, I love building with wood, but wood might be more appropriate here where we are in a fire-prone area to just highlight and have it beautiful on the inside of a building. Wooden soffits, leaf, all of these things, and single pane windows. So again, my husband knows that we have our magic leaf blower and we clean the gutters like at least twice a summer, just as a way to like not have this little kindling pile here go and ignite this area. Wooden soffits, totally beautiful. You are required to put a class 1 fire membrane here, which would either be a sheet of sheetrock, a hardy panel, or Den's glass. So these are all kind of industrial materials that you would have to put up there that are hardened, that would be below this. But then if you end up with lighting and other hole penetrations, that if there's fire in here, it can very easily get into your attic space, even though beautiful wood, it's so pretty. Wooden fences, sorry honey, that's our house, wood fence. Look at that, miles of kindling just baking in the sun. And then there's easy upgrades. I don't have any, what do you call it, like marketing relationship with any of these things, just to say, is really what happens, what's most exposed in your building where there is airflow happening is in your vented roof. So particularly when it's hot out and there's a fire, is you're ending up getting convection where you've got the hotter chimney style at the top where air is flowing from cold to hot through your roof. So if you can have one of these, which is basically, it's either made out of intumescent materials, which kind of fuse shut at a certain temperature, or they're just small enough that embers, a viable ember is not gonna get through, is you just cover your vents with this material. And that could be the ounce of protection that saves your house, no matter what it's made out of. This is a positive from our house. Hardscaping around so that you don't have dry materials up near your house, so that there's just basically nothing flammable there. And the other thing around decks, these areas are sealed with cement board so that flame can't get under your deck, because usually what happens is there's just like kindling and duff and things that can easily burn. And that's pretty much the end of it. So I want to open it up to questions, but I like to end with this quote by one of my favorite great thinkers of our time, who's no longer with us, David Graeber. The ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it's something that we make, and it's something that we can make differently. And then I also like to end on something that I feel very empowering that has motivated me throughout my natural building career, and it's the idea of the butterfly effect, where someone tried to come up with that crazy math equation that's like, okay, we live in a mechanistic world, and then they realize like, no, we live in a system that is so inherently interconnected that you can't separate one event from another. So the seemingly innocent fluttering of a butterfly's wings can cause a tornado 1,000 miles away. So with that, I hope that it encourages everybody that, yeah, we can make a bunch of little positive influences that ideally do like a tornado of positivity and fire resilience in the future. Okay, questions? Yeah.